It's a masterpiece!
I got a fun fact for you. Super Mario Bros. 2 is my favorite sequel to Super Mario Bros. I thought the original Super Mario Bros. Was a pretty good game, especially considering how well it's aged since its release. But even back then, it was a smashing success. Super Mario Bros. Was an instant classic, and it had transformed and saved the video game industry overnight and became a large reason as to why video games even exist today. So, Nintendo obviously decided to cash in on the game's success with a sequel. Super Mario Bros. 2 was created by Nintendo's R&D 4 division, who had primarily worked on The Legend of Zelda prior to the development of the sequel, with Takashi Tezuka making his first directorial debut. While Shigeru Miyamoto helped with the sequel, he never directed it on his own. Instead, he simply helped with designing the levels alongside the rest of the development team. And so, the game was officially released as Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan on June 3rd, 1986, and it was incredibly similar to the first one, but with a hearty dose of difficulty that must have had at least one person at the time compared to the non-existent Dark Souls. Yeah, Mario 2 was built to be a much harder game than the original, and was meant for super players according to the front of the box. However, the extreme difficulty was off-putting to Nintendo of America's localization team at the time, and they touted that the game would be far too difficult for American audiences. With those statements in mind, Nintendo decided not to release the game in North America. But America couldn't just go without a new Mario game, so Nintendo decided to transform another game they were working on at the time into the sequel for American audiences. The game they were working on was called Doki Doki Panic. Oh, so this is where the series started. It was originally a collaboration between Nintendo and Fuji Television, and the game was notable for its vertical level design and picking up object mechanics. So basically Nintendo just took this game and slapped a fresh coat of paint onto it, and thus, Super Mario Bros. 2 USA was created and released on October 9th, 1988. The original Super Mario Bros. 2 would remain in Japan until it was renamed into Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, and was remastered and re-released as a part of the Super Mario All-Stars collection on the SNES. Well, I guess we got two games to look at today. Let's look at the Lost Levels first, considering it was the original Super Mario Bros. 2, and because Nintendo thinks I'm a fucking pussy, and I'm not a fucking pussy. I beat the game, and yeah, I'll say it, I don't like the Lost Levels all that much. Graphically and mechanically, the Lost Levels is pretty similar to the original Mario. One of the more notable changes is, if you choose Luigi on the title screen, you'll find that he now has his standard floatier jump and slippery movements, but I just stuck with Mario for this playthrough. Some textures and sprites have been upgraded, like the ground and mushrooms for instance, but for the most part this is the same game minus the giant elephant in the room, the difficulty. Levels are much harder now, and at points it'll feel like everything in the game is against you. The levels are way longer now with very unforgiving checkpoints, enemies are all over the place, and there are so many situations in the game that require you to take leaps of faith or stop altogether to figure out a way to progress. The game shows its imperfections as early as the first level. The first thing you see in the game is a way to perform a one-up trick, a technique that was present in the original Mario if you knew how to do it, but in this game it's an absolute necessity. The fact that it's a necessity to begin with just goes to show you that the devs knew exactly what they were doing when they designed levels like these, and that's honestly just a dick move. I have absolutely no idea how people are supposed to have enough patience to deal with levels like these without the one-up trick, and since the devs obviously want me to use it, I'm not gonna act like I'm above it. All of the enemies are pretty much the same from the first game, except for these red piranha plants that move faster than your standard Gray Value variety. The Hammer Brothers on later levels will now approach you, and I really could have gone without that addition. There's this blue fake Bowser on the last level. He's pretty much the same as regular Bowser. Okay. However, the most dangerous enemy you'll face in Mario 2 was also your greatest ally in the last game, the Super Mushroom. It's pretty good, right? It gives you an extra hit and is a great way to stay alive in levels. But what if it did the opposite of its primary function? Well, that's where the Poison Mushroom comes in. It looks pretty similar to the regular mushroom, but it instead hurts you, and this is why I have trust issues. In the end, there isn't really a lot to say about Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. It's pretty much a harder Super Mario Bros., and yeah, it can be pretty damn hard. There are these springs that send you up miles into the air, invisible underwater air currents that'll pull you down into pits, invisible block puzzles you constantly have to platform around, the poison mushrooms, wind that already makes difficult platforming even harder, warp pipes that send you to previous worlds, and an abundance of maze puzzles that require you to correctly choose the right path in order to progress. At its best, the Lost Levels can provide a good challenge for those who didn't get much out of the original Super Mario Bros., and at its worst, it has bullshit level design that will infuriate you and make you wonder what pissed off the devs enough to release a game like this. I personally don't think you should bother with this game unless you're really curious, but if you are going to play it, I'd recommend you just play it through the NES Switch Online service, just so you can abuse the rewind function to your liking. That's what I did for this video because, well, I am a fucking pussy after all. I don't feel so bad about it though, considering platforms in one level refused to load in, forcing me to do leaps of faith for several minutes, thinking that's what I needed to do in order to progress. And that alone should tell you what kind of game this is. Let's just move on to the Mario 2 that the US originally got. Now, word on the street is that this game's got a bit of a reputation on the internet for being, well, Super Mario Bros. 2, baby!
Super Mario
It's the
Bros.
masterpiece
2.
of the century,
It's a
still the
masterpiece,
game of the
after
year.
all these years.
Game of the year. But for the sake of this video, I'll try to be as objective as possible. One night while Mario's dreaming, he hears an anonymous voice pleading for him to help free the inhabitants of a world called Subcon from the villainous Wart. This big frog guy who never shows up in another game after this, disregarding a Link's Awakening cameo. The next day, Mario, Luigi, Princess Peach, and Toad find a cave with a staircase in it that ends up teleporting the group to the world of Subcon, confirming that Mario's dream was actually real. So the group ends up progressing through the world of Subcon and eventually ends up defeating War and saving the day. But as the group is celebrating, the entirety of the game is simply revealed to be a dream. Man, don't you just hate these kinds of dreams? The plot's different from the story in the original game, and I kind of like it. It's good to step away from the Save the Princess plot sometimes. The game being revealed to be a dream is kind of lame though. I always hated those kinds of plot twists, and the setup of Mario initially dreaming of the world of Subcon before actually going there himself is kind of odd. Anyway, onto the actual game, and just to get this out of the way now, I love how this game looks. While the original Mario is iconic and still plays well, this game's colors and music just feel much more indicative of how Mario should be. I mean, my god, look at Mario. He actually looks like Mario. The original sprite is iconic, of course, but the puke green for Mario's hair and shirt definitely make the sprite feel like it's from the first game. I vastly prefer how Mario looks here, and he actually has blue overalls. The music's not that bad either, but I can generally only remember like 2 tracks from this game off the top of my head. Well, let's talk about what's probably the most unique gameplay addition to this game, the multiple playable characters. Before the beginning of each world, you get to select between Mario, Luigi, Peach, and Toad, and each of them have their own unique strengths and weaknesses to warrant wanting to play as them. Mario is pretty much your cookie-cutter original recipe Mario. He runs, jumps, and does everything pretty standardly compared to the others, but that also means he has no real weaknesses, so he's still a valid choice. Luigi has his slipperiness and higher jumps like in the Lost Levels, and in a game like this, that also means he has the ability to reach areas that the other characters can't. Princess Peach is the slowest of the bunch, but to make up for that, she has this floating ability that is really useful in a platformer like this, and in some ways, she completely trivializes platforming challenges. Lastly, there's Toad, who has the highest speed out of any character in the game, at the cost of not having a great jump. All these characters are unique from one another, and while some can break the challenge of certain levels in half, there's not a single character that feels significantly worse than the others. The game was designed with every character in mind, and all of them are fun to play as. With that said, I mostly stuck with Luigi just because of his higher jumps, especially used in tandem with the super jump move you can do by crouching down for a few seconds and then launching up into the stratosphere. The other main mechanic in Mario 2 is the item system. You see, in this game, you can't defeat enemies by stomping on them, you know, like in every other Mario game. Instead, you need to pluck objects from the ground and bonk enemies on the head with them. These can range from turnips, Koopa shells, despite Koopas not being in this game at all, turnips, 1-ups, live detonation, and also turnips. You're going to be pulling a lot of turnips. You can also just pick up most standard enemies to throw as well if that suits your fancy. One of the pluckable items you can find are these potions that create a door to this blue zone called Subspace, where pluckable items are replaced with coins. Mushrooms can also seemingly appear here at random to provide you with more health and make you bigger, and yes, there's health in a Mario game. As for the actual gameplay, I really like how this game controls. Jumps don't feel as weighty as in the first game, and movement just feels really snappy as a whole. Structurally, the game is pretty simple as you just run and jump throughout levels in 7 different worlds, and beat a unique boss at the end of every world. Throughout the game, you'll go up against several enemies that are now standards to the Mario universe. Shy Guys, Bob-ombs, Birdo, these enemies were in the original Doki Doki Panic, but I just find it really interesting as to how these enemies that are now iconic came from a game that simply got reskinned into a Mario title. Even though there's a lot of new enemies, no enemies from the original Super Mario Bros. Return. No Goombas, Koopas, Piranha Plants, and especially no Bowser. Power-ups aren't really as prevalent either in this game. While the Power Mushroom and Star return, there's no Fire Flower, and power-ups as a whole don't show up nearly as much as in the original game. Some other mechanics from Super Mario Bros. Do return though, like the warp pipes, or jars, I guess. In a lot of ways, you can tell this game wasn't built to be a Mario game, but while I think the pure gameplay and design of the game are really good and provide a unique identity compared to most other Mario games, it's still not all perfect. I brought up how you could find coins earlier, but unlike the last game where getting 100 of them gave you an extra life, instead they're used in the slot machine minigame at the end of every level to provide lives instead. And I gotta say, this change is pretty lame. I really don't like the slot machine. I rarely get any lives from this, and unlike the first game, if you run out of lives and use the 2 continues the game gives you, then you're just booted back to the very beginning of the game with no way of regaining any progress you had made thus far. There's no button combination to return to the beginning of a world or something. You're just done, you have to do the entire game all over again. Now, Mario 2 isn't a very difficult game, and you can probably get back to where you were quickly with the warp jars, but this is still an incredibly annoying design, and is something that ages this game in a sense, considering most games at the time were somewhat punishing like this. Despite that glaring issue, Mario 2 is a pretty good game. Its uniqueness gives it a lot of charm compared to many other Mario games, and it offers up a lot of replayability with the multiple characters and different ways to beat the game. Both games are valid in carrying the title of being Super Mario Bros. 2, but ultimately, which one is the better game of Super Mario 2 USA? No questions asked. The Lost Levels has some merits, but in the end, the challenging game design is something that I can only recommend to hardcore Mario fans who have mastered the mechanics of the original game. There's too many instances where the game forces you to quickly adjust to its bullshit or flat out take leaps of faith in order to progress. Mario 2 USA is a much more forgiving, unique, and charming experience, especially compared to most other Mario games. Even if the game was reskinned to be a Mario title, it still has a certain style to it that makes it an easy recommendation to anyone who's never tried it before. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that Super Mario Bros. 2 is a masterpiece,
Super
baby!
Mario Bros. 2, baby.
Game of the year every year!
Super Mario Bros. 2, it's a masterpiece.